good to me. It says live in my corner now.
Okay, good evening, everybody. We are live on broadcast. This is our final broadcast hangout of the term, and it's great to have you on with us. This evening, we're going to be talking about social justice. We're going to be looking at it in the Bible, and we'll be looking at it in culture and seeing how we can help make connections between the two. We've got Martin Charlesworth on with us, and he'll be introducing himself to us in just a few moments. Let me first, though, explain how the evening will work. So we're going to have about half an hour where we'll be listening to some teaching. As the teaching is happening, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you've got. So if you're watching on the Google Hangout, you should see near the bottom right of your screen a place where you can type in your questions, and then we will be able to pick those questions up and incorporate them into this session. If you're not watching on the Google Hangout, maybe you're on YouTube or watching in some other way, you could ask your questions via Twitter. So our Twitter account is @BroadcastCP. So if you send us either a direct message or send us a tweet with your question, we can make sure that gets asked. So after the half hour of teaching, then we'll be looking through the questions that we've got, and we'll put the questions to Martin and see what he has to say about them. So anything that he says that sparks a thought, that relates to what's going on in your own situation, or that you'd like him to expand or elaborate on, then just ask it as a question. Also, during the Q&A, if one of the answers to a question prompts another question, we can keep going with them as long as we want to. We'll wrap it up at about 8:30. So yeah, ask your questions as we go. So I'm going to hand over to Martin now. So maybe, Martin, if you'd start by introducing yourself to us, tell us a bit about what you do, about the Jubilee Plus organisation that you work with as well. And then after you've introduced yourself, feel free to get right into your content.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom, and good to speak to everyone who's joining us this evening. Great to have you with us. So I've been involved as a church leader 25 years in Shropshire, in a town called Shrewsbury, led a church for 20 of those years, which focused a lot on social action. As a result of that, in 2012, I was asked by New Frontiers, as it was then, to start an initiative to help capacity build in social action for churches across the country. That led to an initiative called Jubilee Plus, which I now lead. It's now a charity, works with different denominations, capacity building for churches, networking, conferencing, training, teaching, etc. And our vision is to see the church in the UK be a champion of the poor and a means to healthy communities across the nation. So that's what I do. I do that 2 days a week and still based in my local church. And Tom has asked me to do, first of all, just a little introduction to a kind of theological framework for what we're doing, which, by the way, is incredibly important because there's a lot of cultural motivation towards social justice issues in our culture today. A lot of that's really good motivation, but it will never be a sufficient foundation in church for what we do. So it's important to have a theological approach. There are many ways you can look at it. So here's my favorite one, which is as follows. Starting with Jesus himself and thinking of his own manifesto, Luke chapter 4, the so-called Nazareth manifesto. I'm sure you're familiar with it anyway, all of you who are listening in on this. Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, in a nutshell, I think it's fair to say that within that we have gospel proclamation, we have healing and miracles, we have getting set free from sin, from demonic oppression, and also this mysterious ingredient, proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. Now, what did that mean theologically? What did that mean to the first listeners? Well, it goes back, of course, to Isaiah 61 and the servant of the Lord prophecy there. And the year of the Lord's favor, basically in Jewish thinking, referred back to the, even before that, to the Mosaic law and the year of Jubilee recorded in Leviticus 25. So to a Jew listening to Jesus then, they would have thought, wow, Jesus is going to bring in some kind of Jubilee year where land was returned to the families, debts were released, bonded laborers got free, etc. So there's some kind of socio-economic blessing that comes with the gospel. That's the implication of that particular manifesto. Now, it's not going to be the law of Moses. It's going to be a New Testament version of that. Incidentally, that's why we call our organization Jubilee Plus. There was a Jubilee in the Old Testament. The big question is, what's the Jubilee in the New Testament? It's a Jubilee Plus. That's my kind of thesis. So if Jesus said, today this is being fulfilled, there's going to be all these dimensions to the gospel. There's a kind of socioeconomic blessing implicit in the coming of God's kingdom. So that's the basic thesis that I start from. Now, when you look into the New Testament, you see that it's never prescribed in terms of laws and exact details, because that's not the way the kingdom of God works. So we need to then follow the leading of the Spirit in the early church to see what do they do about this year of the Lord's favor. What did it mean to them? And here's a good way of thinking about it. Have a look at the first church. So we see in the Jerusalem church a very great emphasis on resolving questions of resources, of economic issues, of injustice issues, of poverty issues within that church community. Voluntary sharing of goods, organization to help widows with the food bank of the day, which was recorded in Acts 6, i.e. the daily distribution of food, to use Acts' own words. So we see an incredible sense of dealing with economic, social justice type issues, even within the very first church and the very first months of the life of the church after the day of Pentecost. And my understanding would be this is how the Spirit began to lead the Christians church in the early days to express the year of the Lord's favor, to see that social justice, care for the poor was very important, starting incidentally within the church community, but significantly moving out from the church community. Two dimensions, you need both, you can't just have one. So this would be the background then for Paul and Peter discussing Paul's mission amongst the Gentile churches as recorded in Galatians 2 verse 10, where Peter was saying, well, look, we're working with the Jews, planting churches in Judea and in the Jewish districts. You're obviously called to the Gentiles. We're okay with that. It's good to preach the gospel to them. We support you. We give the right hand of fellowship. But, Peter says to Paul, remember the poor. Paul said, no problem. That's the very thing I wanted to do. So they shook hands on it and off they went. What did that actually mean? What that meant was that Peter, in working with the Jewish churches, instinctively put an emphasis on remembering the poor as they were planting churches amongst the Jews. And his fear was that Paul would start church planting amongst the Gentiles without that ingredient in those Gentile communities. And he said, no, we can't do that. We can't create a disparity between a church in a different district or nation or socioeconomic group that suddenly says, oh, well, remembering the poor isn't particularly important round here. Peter said, no, we can't do that. Paul said, no, we're not going to do that. So here's an interesting theological foundation then. On the basis of the year of the Lord's favor, as experienced by the early churches, the apostles came to an agreement that remembering the poor, whatever that means, that requires a little bit of explanation, obviously, in different cultures, but remembering the poor was intrinsic to church planting, gospel proclamation, and going from one culture to another. Bear in mind, incidentally, that sociologists will tell us that in any community in the first century, you would probably say those who were on minimal subsistence level or in danger of poverty would probably be about 50% of the population of any community. 50%. That's an important point. So remembering the poor is remembering that 50%. And so Paul later goes on in Galatians 6 to say that we should be doing good to all people, especially the household of faith, Galatians 6:10. So doing good to all people is another way of expressing this, remembering the poor, especially the household of faith, in the sense that what we've got to get it right amongst the poor in the churches in order to have integrity to care for those outside the churches. So there's 10 minutes for you. I hope that's okay, Tom. 10 minutes as promised. Just a theological framework, starting with Jesus, starting in Luke 4, which is a good place to start because it's a kind of declaratory position. It's a manifesto position, looking back to Isaiah 61 and then back to Leviticus 25, which are the reference in historically, and then looking forward with a couple of examples in the early church. So I suggest that's a good framework, and it reminds us that social justice cannot be divorced from an expectation of the miraculous, preaching the gospel, seeking to overcome all the forces of darkness that affect people's lives in all sorts of different other personal ways. So there's a kind of integrated model of mission implied, to use modern terminology to describe the different dimensions that Jesus puts within there. So the second thing then, having said all that, and you may want to come back with questions biblically and theologically, please do. I'm more than happy to do that. And incidentally, just to say at that point, some of our teaching from the Jubilee Plus team's point of view, and some of my teaching on this is available online on the Jubilee Plus website, jubilee-plus.org, jubilee-plus.org. There's a lot of downloads and audios that you can pick up there with theological paradigms and more explanation of that. So the second issue is what are the kind of cultural conversations or the key cultural connecting points? Well, to most of you listening tonight, they'd be pretty obvious to you, I'm sure. And many of you will know more about some of them than I do. Here's a few that strike me as prominent ones. One that we focused on in the Jubilee Plus team is the question of what we call the myth of the undeserving poor. In fact, my colleague Natalie Williams and I have written a book by that name, The Myth of the Undeserving Poor. If you're interested, it's available on Amazon, and there's a Kindle version as well, and an audio book on our website. Now, what we've identified there is how in our culture sometimes, with people in poverty and in the benefit cycle and so forth, that there has been a sense of dividing them away from the rest of society in terms of cultural attitudes in the media, in politics, and sometimes even in the church. And so I think that's a big cultural conversation, which has big resonance in terms of the media, and some of you may want to talk further about that. Here's a second big cultural conversation that I think is going to become major in the next few years, and that is social care. All issues around social care, particularly relating to elderly, disabled. It's an enormous challenge for our society, with demographic changes and aging population, declining capacity of local authorities, fragmenting of family structures, a kind of epidemic of loneliness. Many of you will be fully aware of this, but this is a big conversation. I recently spoke to the chief executive of the local authority in our area, who said it's a gigantic black hole as far as they're concerned, and he wanted a conversation with the churches about their suggested solutions. Open conversation, the sort of thing that wouldn't have happened 10 or 20 years ago, but it's happening all over the country, and it'll be happening in your part of the country as well, whether you're in an urban context or a rural context, north or south. The issues are fairly similar in that area. Related to that, incidentally, so we've spoken about the myth of the undeserving poor, stigmatizing poverty, that is, we've spoken about social care. I think there's a third general conversation issue that's very important, and that is the declining capacity of local authorities to provide services. And I am amazed at the way that local authorities really want to get in conversation with churches and the voluntary sector in terms of things that they can no longer do. I've spoken to senior people in local authority in different parts of the country. It's the same story, more or less, everywhere. It's a cultural conversation. It's part of our culture now that local authorities' capacity is declining very fast, and as far as we can see, economically, pretty permanently. There's no chance of that turning around in the next decade or two, in my opinion. There's a third one. Now, the fourth one is very topical. Immigration. Here we are recording this post-referendum, post-Brexit. Immigration is an increasingly hot topic in our society, and we will undoubtedly be facing an increasing challenge in the next years with the stigmatization of immigrant communities, whether they be European immigrant communities or others, with a fresh sharpness, I think, caused by the decision to leave the European Union, which has given kind of fresh energy to some parts of our culture which have held racist attitudes in this area. So I think there's a whole network of issues around there that have always been important, but they are coming very, very sharply to prominence now. It's a key cultural conversation. Where does the church stand? What can the church do? What issues are rising? You may want to discuss these. I've got plenty more I could say on that, but I see this as a red hot topic, immigration in general. And then fifthly, a subsection of that, part of the immigration issue, but a very, very important one, is the issue of refugees and asylum seekers. Now here we're talking about people moving to our country, not from the EU by and large, but from the rest of the world. And they're coming in their thousands. I speak to people involved in ministries there working with refugees and asylum seekers regularly. Their universal prediction is these numbers are going to grow. And the capacity of our nation to deal with them psychologically, in terms of human resources, in terms of housing, in terms of cultural acceptance, is going to be tested. And my prediction is the church is going to be on the forefront of this in an ever more evident way. So there's 5 suggestions for you as points of cultural connection. Now, obviously, there are more. And there are some cultural conversations which are subsections of these 5 that I've mentioned to you. And there are things that you think, well, why didn't he put that on the list? Well, simply because Tom only gave me half an hour. So I'm sticking to my time. But those seem to me to be very, very prominent ones. And if I could just go back and just make a general comment here that affects many of these different issues. What I have learned through the work I've done with Jubilee Plus is one of the most important areas where the church has a unique capacity is building community for people, and related to that, imparting to them life skills, confidence, practical life skills of many types. The more I've worked in different areas, the more convinced I am that this is one of the most important things. It relates to poverty in general, people on the fringe of society. It relates to social care. It relates to immigrant communities in all sorts of different ways. And this kind of life skills deficit is not resolved by financial grants and financial capacity from government. It's resolved by working with people very closely individually. So I leave that as a passing thought on the cultural conversations issue, which some of you may want to pick up. So the third thing that I've been asked to just comment on for the last 10 minutes is How do we connect the two? We have a theological mandate and a theological paradigm based on Christ himself and the early church that seems to be very, very strong biblically. We have many pressing needs in our society. How do we make the connection? And how do we make the connection, particularly in the light of the fact that we live in a pretty uncertain time now in terms of our political stability, post-Brexit decision, our economy, and if our economy stumbles, the poorest are the ones who are most vulnerable. There are many, many issues up for grabs. So how do we make the connections? Well, here are just a few suggestions, which I'll finish my presentation with, just to see if this helps you. I travel a lot around the country in my capacity working for Jubilee Plus. I see a lot of churches in action, and I'm amazed at what I see. It's absolutely fantastic what is going on. But what I think I've noticed in the last few years is that, particularly since the financial crash in 2008, there's been a sharp increase of church-based social action projects and concern for social justice issues. It's been very marked in some obvious areas like street pastors, food banks, and things like that, but it's more general than that. And secondly, what I've noticed is that people are beginning to notice the church in a fresh way. Here's the paradox. Just as it looked as though we were losing the moral arguments, if I can put it like that, for Christian lifestyle values as generic in our society, it seems like we have an opportunity to win some social arguments. Just as people were writing off the church, it seems that the church has an opportunity to reinvent its image to some extent by being at the forefront of areas that society is finding very, very hard to deal with. And so church-based projects and initiatives are the bridge that connects our culture to us and to our theology and to our outlook. Obviously, other things do as well. The work of individuals in public life and in communities, in an individual capacity, in a family capacity. I'm absolutely endorsing all those. But it's the things that we specially organize and work on that tend to get noticed by people. And I think a further key to connecting the two is doing good networking around the projects and the things we're involved with, is to actually really work out who's out there, who's interested in what we're doing, who can we work with, who can help us, who can we help, who needs to know. And sometimes we're not very good at that. We're so involved in what we're doing, heads down, hard work, helping people in real need, that we forget sometimes that we actually need to connect quite widely into our culture. And in our locality, we've done that in all sorts of ways, getting into the voluntary sector networks, working with business, working with housing associations. We've had open days for some of our projects and done some good PR. And I think that is important, not so much in terms of self-promotion, but in terms of building a bridge over which people can go and communicate with you at a deeper level and with whom you can share. So in terms of connecting the two, it starts, I think, primarily with the church-based activities, initiatives, projects, things we're doing. We need to network around those areas and not just work in splendid isolation if we possibly can. And thirdly, I think relating to civic leaders, political leaders and others is is a really important thing to do. It's not always easy, but it's getting easier generally in the country because of the changing culture towards these sort of areas. Quite recently, we had a food bank meeting for our whole county, which we hosted with all the different food banks and the officers from the local council who are responsible for emergency provision. A fascinating meeting, really engaging with leaders. I personally make a policy of going to meet my MP as often as I can, personally, rather than just writing to them. I go and see them. Last week, I spoke at length to my local councillor about things going on. I think a culture of relating to people involved in public policy, whoever they are, is really good. Finally, and I haven't said that much about this up until this point, but there is a very important role for advocacy and campaigning. One of my friends heading up a big refugee initiative was able to speak on national media this week as a result of the political uncertainties and turmoil. There is a place for advocacy in terms of campaigning on different issues nationally. There's a place for advocacy in terms of going and talking to those in authority like your MPs. There's a place for advocacy in terms of things at a much more individual level. Let me just give you an example from our own experience. We, in our church, we have a strategic relationship with our local job centre plus. Now, that's not something everyone can achieve, and it's not always easy, but we've got a voice there, and we have on occasion gone to them and said, look, here's one of our clients, we're trying to help get a job through our job club facility. They're having this many problems with the way you operate the system, etc., etc. And so we do advocacy just on a one-to-one level. And I think there is a place for advocacy and campaigning, sometimes on a very big national scale, sometimes just taking the stories and situations of one or two people to the relevant person. And a final point on this is something that we at Jubilee Plus have been working on, is that actually research is quite important. So we've been developing research projects into what are the churches actually doing. We've done one on debt relief. We've done one on early years provision. We're currently working on a research project of churches working with older people, working with the elderly. And so we're trying to draw some meaningful statistics together to use in public conversations. One of our research papers was quoted by an MP in the House of Commons in the last 3 months in a debate. And research is very, very useful. So we're interested in that. If any of you are interested in contributing to that, do contact us, do look at the papers that we have written on behalf of the churches. There is much more that could be said about all these things. All I'm doing is just giving you a few bullet points for our conversation. So connecting the two, lots of things we can do. And I think the final thing I would say on connecting the two is, social action, social justice issues are all part of a kind of integrated mission. So social action shouldn't really be seen too separately from what your church is doing in terms of community life generally, in terms of mission, in terms of community presence, blessing the community, evangelistic outreach, befriending neighbors, all those kind of things as well. And so the closer we keep these things together, the better. That's the responsibility of the church leaders and elders. And that's a constant challenge for many. But I believe in very vigorous social action and social justice work. But I also believe that it's really at its strongest when it's carefully integrated into the church, supported by prayer, overseen by suitably qualified spiritual overseers and pastors and elders, and that's what we need to aspire to. And obviously, all these things have how they work out depends on the scale you're operating on. So churches in the wider national charismatic movement obviously vary from churches of thousands to churches of hundreds to churches of less than 100 people. And so I always encourage people to contextualize anything that might be taught in terms of the size of your church. And don't be afraid to do small things well and not try and do big things that are beyond the capacity of what you can do. Don't try and copy churches with resources far beyond what you have available to yourself. If you start small and you're faithful with that, the likelihood is that you will find opportunity to multiply things as time goes on. Tom, half an hour is up. I'm sticking to the schedule you requested, and so I'm keen to hand back to you and to take questions.
Great, thank you, Mo. Thank you so much for all of that. So let me just recap for anyone who's joined us after the introduction how we do the question. So there are a few ways you could ask your question. If you're on a Google Hangout with us, then in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can type in any question you have, and we'll make sure that Martin gets asked that question. If you want to do it in another way, or if you would prefer to, you could ask your question on Twitter. So we're at BroadcastCP. Or also if you put like a comment on our Facebook page with your question, we will ask it as well. So we've had a question come in while you were talking, so we'll start with this one.
Okay.
So the question is, should provision of food be linked to a response of work? And there's a Bible verse quoted, which is 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10, that says, if a man does not work, he shall not eat. And then the question says, does Jubilee Plus propose a link/solution?
Well, I think that it's a good question. The provision, the context of Paul in Corinthians is, in Thessalonians, is dealing with someone who is part of the faith community, who is making a conscious decision to adopt a lazy and self-indulgent lifestyle that does not involve working. And Paul's saying to the church, in that case, you're not going to bail that person out permanently. There needs to be some kind of process of accountability for the support given. Broadly speaking, I think that's the context of that. So it's within the faith community. It's part of the discipling process that people who are professing faith in Christ should be willing to work, and if they're not, they should be challenged. So that would be my understanding of the context of that verse. When we're dealing with food bank culture, we're dealing with people outside the church, and I believe, and so the verse doesn't apply directly to them because they're not in the community of faith being discipled. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is the verse might help us with an underlying principle, which is that we don't want to create dependency on food provision through food banks that discourages personal initiative and taking responsibility and looking for work. And I would say that is a good general principle for the running of food banks, which should be seen as emergency provision rather than longer term provision. And there is a debate amongst people operating food banks and an emotional battle that goes on over this issue continually. My own view is that we should see it as emergency provision and signpost and support people to go beyond the emergency and find other resources. But a corollary of that would be that food banks in churches run best with other projects. So you can signpost people to other things that you're doing, such as job clubs and life skills courses and debt management projects, etc. So that would be a few comments around that very important and helpful question.
Great, thank you very much. We've had another one come in. This one's on Twitter, so if you do want to tweet it, it's at BroadcastCP. And this one says, does this, I presume by this, it means what you've been talking about as a whole, does this relate to church plants or only to established churches?
That's a very good question, and thank you to the questioner. And it's something I'm quite often asked, actually. I would say that Paul and Peter's agreement that we should remember the poor in Galatians 2:10 does not distinguish between churches and church plants. It's a missional principle that wherever the church goes, they should remember the poor, even in a church planting phase. I remember dealing with a church plant once that had very, very few people in it. And they were helping one needy person. And they said to me, that's all we can do. Do you think we should do that? I said, definitely. Don't try and help more than one person at the moment, because look at your resources you haven't got, but do help that one person, and you'll find over the years that you'll find greater capacity. So I would say put social action, care for the poor into the DNA of the church plant from the beginning, but be careful how you do it in terms of not taking on more than you can manage and burning yourself out in the process. But I don't agree with the philosophy that some people adopt, that we'll keep social action and the needs of the poor in the background for a few years until we get the church established. I can't believe that that is the methodology adopted in the New Testament, bearing in mind that in any given community, about 50% of the population might be in one form of need or another most of the time.
Thank you. So please do keep your questions coming on the Hangout, on Twitter or on Facebook. I'd like to ask you a question of my own, if I may, at this point.
Yeah, sure.
Related, when you were talking about the church-based projects being the bridge, so I was wondering what your view is on, are we saying that churches should make a point of starting a project for the sake of having something with the church brand, so to speak, and visibility? Or would you say that the point is getting the work done, even if it's not known that it's linked to the church? Does the question make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, the highest priority is to do the mission of God, and not to get known or for any sort of PR success out of it. So I would say that the priority is to do the things that God leads us to do, and I think there's a prophetic and a practical component to that. We'll find the circumstances of our churches lead us to people in certain types of need. We think, right, that's the issue for us. Or we have something prophetic, or we have someone gifted in a particular way in the church, which is like a prophetic sign. So I think we do what God calls us to do, to care for people, irrespective of whether we can connect it to our culture in the long term as a first priority. But once we've gone down that road, there is a strategic benefit of connecting with our community and saying, this is what we're doing. Partly to get their help, and secondly, to allow the works of God to be visible to them as a bridge in the way that I described earlier on.
Very good. Okie doke. Well, we haven't had any other questions come through. Yeah, let me just ask you like a couple more quick fire things then that could help us out. And when you were talking about advocacy and campaigning, could you maybe recommend one or two issues that campaigning and advocating for, maybe on a national level right now, it would be the right moment that we could make an impact on something, maybe issues that we're not all familiar with, perhaps? Are there any that come to mind that would be a good place to start?
Well, it all depends on what your particular interests are, and Christians tend to have a number of different interests. I think that there has been a very effective development in recent years of Christian campaigning concerning human trafficking. And I would encourage people to be aware of that. There are a number of different organisations that have fronted that up, and there have been legislative benefits to that already that have been influenced by Christians, but campaigning locally can also highlight issues of trafficking going on in your particular community. I think that we may reach the point soon where campaigning concerning the support of immigrant communities may become an issue. It hasn't quite been formulated yet, but in the current national environment, we may find that will develop very much. So there's just a couple of examples. Obviously, more generically, issues like the environment are very important, and I consider environmentalism, incidentally, to be a social justice issue, not just a self-protection issue. And the main reason for that is that the environment has environmental degradation has a disproportionately severe effect on poorer parts of the world and the developing world. So what we do with the environment affects them disproportionately. So that would be another one. I'm reluctant to be too specific there, Tom, because I think people have to have a sense of leading and so on. But there are all sorts of organisations. Tier Fund run different type of campaigns. The organisation CARE runs campaigns relating to sort of family and community type issues. There are a whole variety of different organisations out there. Jubilee Plus is not particularly positioned to recommend this or recommend that, but just to recommend activism relating to your community. And some things are really just local campaigning. What's going on in your community that needs addressing. There was a lot of campaigning some time ago concerning sort of payday lenders and lending and all the kind of payday loans and all the kind of vast interest rates have been charged. That's led to some changes, and Christians were very involved in campaigning on that kind of issue, which is a critical issue socially as well.
I've had a follow-up question to the one earlier about church plants and established churches. So the same person has followed up by tweeting us, can you recommend ways to explore the local needs and to research what God would want us to do? So
that's another very good question. And one of the weaknesses of churches that I've noticed generally is that we don't research what's going on in our communities. The simplest way to research what's going on in your community, it's not a systematic method, but it's a very simple method, is go and talk to your local councillors. What they know is phenomenal because they are on the ground dealing with their community in a nitty-gritty day-to-day way that's totally different from your MP. And they will very quickly, in almost every case, tell you these are the main issues going on in our community that concern us. So that's a very, very simple way of doing it. Other ways are to do surveys. We've done a house-to-house survey in one area that we work in our church and discovered a few things about loneliness and single occupancy homes and various different things that we didn't know were there. You can look up certain things in terms of government statistics or local authority statistics by going to their websites. So there's a few starters, but I think a really good way is just talk to your councillors in the area and say, what's really going on here. You will be amazed at what you discover.
Great, thank you. Questions still coming in through Twitter. So let me ask you the next one. Do you feel that the gospel is not preached when working with the poor on a general basis?
Well, another very astute question. The answer is that there's a high risk that the gospel is not preached. And there are a number of issues here that we do have to consider. You'll probably remember at the beginning, and the questioner will certainly remember, I'm sure, that I made the point that there was a kind of integrated missional model implied by Jesus's own explanation in Luke chapter 4, and also expressed through Jesus's ministry, where we see compassion for the poor, economic provision, feeding of the 5,000, deliverance from evil, healing of the sick, building of community, all sorts of different things going on simultaneously with preaching the gospel. There is a very big risk that social action becomes a non-evangelistic activity. And I think it's the responsibility of church leaders to keep a very close eye on this and to make sure that an appropriate level of sensitive but clear witnessing to Christ is part of the culture of what we are doing. And the context will vary as to how would be the most appropriate thing, what is the most appropriate thing to do. And another thing that I have noticed is often social activists are not necessarily evangelistically gifted, but they are gifted with compassion, mercy, and a lot of energy to get alongside people. And so finding evangelistically gifted people, putting them in the mix, is a very important thing that I would suggest should be done. And also for church leaders to work with project leaders very closely and say, how can we make sure that Christ is made known to them in appropriate ways? Is it right for us to be offering prayer, to making invitations to different meetings, to alpha courses? The context of what we do is so varied that there can't be any general rule that we could say, but I think the risk implied in the questionnaire is a real risk and is a serious risk, which the culture of churches with the New Frontiers or similar theological background should have the capacity to overcome and deal with. Some other churches are, might be less well equipped to address that, but it's a big challenge for us, and we'll see how we go in the next generation. I'm constantly asked this question, by the way, and constantly wrestling with it even in my own church situation.
Great. Well, linked in to what you were saying about different types of church, well, the next question that's come through on Twitter is, how can we work effectively with other churches of different denominations?
Well, I think that's it's a good aspiration to do that, it depends what the project is, really, as to how it works out. There are some city-wide initiatives, shall we say, street pastors is a good one, and the equivalents, which are constituted in such a way as they're designed to be multi-church. And so we in our town are very committed to street pastors. We work across all the denominations very clearly. We work at every level of their organization in support of what they do. And other projects work best with one or perhaps two churches working together. So I don't think there is a general answer, but I think that one danger is not to enter into sort of contractual agreements with other churches which prevent you expressing your faith in a meaningful way in the project that you're working in. I would say that would be a risk that we need to be at. And we also need to make sure that management of finances and people and time and resources is responsibly carried when it's carried outside our local church. And there can be some risks involved in that need to be weighed carefully. So yes, working with other churches, sometimes working as a church on your own. Don't get tied into a situation where you can't really express your faith in a meaningful way simply because other churches don't particularly like that. That would make that problematical, I think, in the long run.
Thank you. We've had another one come through here on the Hangout, and the question is, how do you get involved with refugees?
Sorry, how do you get involved?
With refugees.
With refugees?
Yes.
Yeah, very good question. Talk to your local council, and for that matter, councillors, but council officers, and discuss with them what refugee issues exist in your community. And the point worth making here is that the situation is so varied across the nation. We have hundreds of different situations where in some parts of the country the refugee question is so painfully obvious, it's right there in your face, and for others it's hidden beneath the surface. But many councils now are preparing for the influx of the 20,000 Syrian refugees that the government promised to take in the lifetime of this parliament, and are looking for support in that. So you can talk to your local authority about that. And you might be interested in national organizations like one called For Refugees. That's just one word, For Refugees, FOR Refugees. You might be interested to look up some of the Christian charities such as the Boaz Trust based in Manchester, where you are, Tom, and the Refugee Support Network based in London is quite a significant one for that area. So I think it would be worth Googling some of the Christian organizations, and there are quite a few developing. I don't know them all. But do talk to your council, and you'll find, well, information about what situation is with refugees in your area, and they'll have somebody in the council who's responsible for that area. That I don't know what title they'll hold in your council, but you can find it.
Great. Well, do keep questions coming. We've got about 10 more minutes if you do have any more questions. So just while we're giving people a moment, if they do have anything else. A while ago, when you were talking about food banks, you were saying we don't want people to have a dependency on food banks. I'm just wondering if there are any other things that come to mind that you think are dangers, perhaps, of things that we would do in a well-intentioned way, but that might be counterproductive as we're engaging in social action. Is there anything else that comes up that you'd want to just alert us to, perhaps?
Food banks is the obvious one, because you've got an immediate physical provision that you're offering people that can become, like a permanent reality. I think that the more general point is that if you're working with any sector of the community, there are people who just want to lean on you for your help. Let's just take working with the elderly, befriending the elderly. And you have to make a judgment really as to how much of that is truly helpful to them and how much of it isn't helpful to them. And I think that varies from project to project, from social group to social group. I don't think I'd want to be more specific than that, but to say that it is, it's a danger that can exist in any particular context. It's been highlighted in food banks very, very strongly because of the nature of what they are, and the fact that you're giving people something physical that they can, have as long as they want if you allow them, and that tends to make them avoid responsibility. I think that one of the things we're always wanting to do is to help people to take responsibility for their lives, little by little, in ways that are possible for them to do, given their mental and social and spiritual and life skills capacity, which vary. And I think learning the judgment of how to help people along that road is one of the great arts of this kind of work.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much. I've not had any more questions come through, so I think what we'll do is wrap the hang up up at this point in time. So this is the last one of this term. So I hope all of you who are watching have a wonderful summer. We'll be back on in September with some more hangouts and other content. So just watch your email and I'll let you know about that. Also in September, there is a day conference coming up with Colin Barron and Jim Harper, who will be talking about building churches in deprived areas. So that will link a little bit to what we've been talking about today. I will send out the details about that as well. Now, I was just going to go to you to give a final comment, but another question has just popped up. So if you don't mind, we'll maybe do an answer to this.
Let's do one more. Yeah, okay.
Comment. So this last question that's come through is, does refugee status prevent a person having a career in their original profession in the UK?
That's a very technical question, and that will depend on the recognition of qualifications of that particular career or training. For a start, most people, while they're seeking asylum, are not in a position where they can engage in their career. So the critical thing is whether they receive the permission for asylum or not. And so one of the critical questions with refugees is that a lot of people are in the kind of no man's land of waiting for a decision, which goes on for a long time. I'm not a technical expert in that area, but as I understand it, that can have significant problems in terms of employment and pursuing their particular qualifications or career. But I would recommend the questioner to talk to people more directly involved in refugee work on the ground for a more precise answer to the details of that. I guess it could vary from person to person, situation to situation.
Well, thank you very much for your teaching. Thank you for your wonderful wisdom, answering a whole range of questions so thoughtfully and so helpfully. Would you like to, before we go off air, is there any final comments or encouragement or else you'd give?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Tom. Well, thanks everyone for listening. That's the first thing. Really enjoyed the opportunity. I hope it's beneficial to you. Just to remind everyone, really, if they're interested in what Jubilee Plus is doing, do have a look at our website, jubilee-plus, that is, .org. And there's lots of material there on all sorts of things. And if you are interested, 29th, since we're talking about conferences, and you've initiated that, Tom, I feel free to say 29th of October, Jubilee Plus has its national annual conference, which this year is in Darlington in the northeast. Guest speaker, Krish Kandaya. Saturday the 29th of October. Details on the website if anyone's interested in coming and joining us there. Tremendous seminars and networking opportunity. Lots of interesting people will be gathering there. But thanks for having me, and hope everything continues to go well next year with Broadcast Theology, and it's great to be part of it for this evening. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and have a good rest of the evening and a good summer. Bye-bye.